Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. This podcast of the People's Pharmacy is brought to you by Squatty Potty Toilet Stools. They create healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. Learn more about toilet posture and health at squattypotty.com. That's SQUATTYPOTTY.com.
We're all exposed to a range of chemicals in our daily lives, from compounds in shampoo to whatever's in the water we drink. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Are any of the hundreds of chemicals we encounter so frequently dangerous? If so, are there ways to avoid or eliminate them? Is organic food worth the higher price?
Bruce Laurie and Rick Smith wrote Slow Death by Rubber Duck, in which they looked at everyday chemicals in our bodies. Now they've written Toxin, ToxOut, about how we can get those compounds out of our bodies.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, find out how the authors devised experiments on themselves to test detox techniques.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, the flu is making an appearance around the country, but in many cases it isn't behaving like the usual influenza. There are reports that people are ill with aches and fatigue. They lose their appetites, but they don't have much fever, and they aren't coughing and sneezing as they normally would with flu. Experts have expressed concern that some of these cases may be misdiagnosed as bacterial infections and mistreated with antibiotics, which are appropriate against bacteria but worthless against flu viruses. They're debating among themselves whether the flu shot may be offering partial protection against type A influenza, leading it to produce different symptoms from the usual flu infection. Most public health experts recommend getting immunized, even though the vaccine this year is an imperfect match for the flu viruses that are circulating. It will be months before we know whether this strategy is effective. People who begin to feel ill should check with the doctor immediately, as antiviral medicines can help if taken within the first 2 days of symptoms.
People at risk for diabetes are often advised to concentrate on whole grains, vegetables, and other types of minimally processed foods that don't make blood sugar rise quickly. A new study from Harvard suggests, however, that focusing the diet on foods with a low glycemic index, the technical term for foods that don't produce a rapid rise in blood sugar, doesn't matter for insulin sensitivity, blood pressure, or cholesterol levels. In the study, 163 overweight people with borderline high blood pressure were divided into 4 groups who were provided specific diets for 5 weeks. All the meals were provided to them based on a DASH diet plan with lots of vegetables and low-fat dairy. Some participants got a high-carb, high glycemic index diet, while others got a low-carb, low glycemic index diet. The other 2 groups got different combinations. There were no significant benefits in blood pressure, blood fat levels, or insulin sensitivity. Perhaps this is because the DASH diet is already effective at lowering blood pressure, so further tweaking wasn't enough to change the body's response noticeably.
When public health authorities give dietary recommendations to help lower blood pressure and reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, they usually focus on salt. We're all advised to cut our sodium intake. 2 scientists point out that most of the salt in our diets comes from processed foods, which are also high in sugar. They suggest that sugars, particularly fructose, may be just as responsible as salt for boosting blood pressure, and conclude that the public should be warned to stay away from such foods and sugar-sweetened beverages.
Certain medical devices are widely used by consumers to control dangerous disease symptoms. 2 of them, epinephrine self-injection and asthma inhalers, are used in emergency situations. A new study shows that far too many patients don't know how to use their life-saving devices correctly. A study of patients who demonstrated how they use their devices found that only 16% of those with an EpiPen used it correctly. Even fewer asthma patients, only 7%, were able to demonstrate proper use of a metered dose inhaler. The authors conclude that there's room for improvement in ensuring patients are able to correctly self-administer medications.
Yoga is real exercise, according to a meta-analysis of 32 randomized controlled trials. The investigators found that yoga can help people lose weight, lower their blood pressure, reduce their heart rate, and control their cholesterol levels. The people in the control groups were not exercising. In studies that compared yoga to other forms of exercise, yoga showed no advantage. But because it's a readily accessible form of activity for people with joint problems and the elderly, the researchers suggest it should be promoted more effectively.
The saying, "you're only as old as you feel," is supported by new epidemiological research. Scientists in London enrolled 6,000 older people a decade ago and tracked their attitudes and activities. People who reported feeling younger than their chronological age were more likely to survive and were in better health after 8 years. About 2/3 of those in the study felt at least 3 years younger than their actual ages. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Do you worry about the toxins you're exposed to on a daily basis? Do you wonder if it's possible to get those chemicals out of your body? Our guests today have done some innovative experiments on themselves, and they're here to tell us how we can get harmful chemicals out of our bodies.
Bruce Laurie is a leading environmental thinker, writer, and speaker, and is president of the Ivy Foundation and director of several organizations in Canada and the United States. Rick Smith is a prominent Canadian author and environmentalist, executive director of the Broadbent Institute, and was the executive director of Environmental Defense Canada for almost 10 years. They wrote Slow Death by Rubber Duck. Their new book is Toxin, ToxOut.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Bruce Laurie and Rick Smith. We are excited to have you here to talk about your wonderful book, Toxin, ToxOut.
And we're excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Nice to have you back on the People's Pharmacy. So you have described actual drops in our exposures to things that we are all kind of concerned about, like lead, DDT, dioxins. I mean, these were bad actors a decade or 3 ago. And now we're kind of letting down our guard. But are there other things that still worry you?
Well, as you say, when governments get their acts together and properly regulate these chemicals, as has happened with lead and DDT, you see dramatic reductions, not just in the environment, but in people's bodies. So, when I was a kid driving around in the back of my parents' car in the 1970s, I was breathing in a lot of leaded gasoline fumes. And the good news with lead and other things is that the levels in my kids' bodies are a fraction of what they are in mine and in my parents. Unfortunately, we've replaced lead and other crummy chemicals with other modern convenience chemicals that also happen to be toxic to the human body. So all the things we write about in the book, triclosan, this antibacterial chemical, the flame retardants, BPA continues to be in plastic. So these are the chemicals, this newer generation of still toxic pollutants are what we focus on in the book.
Well, you just mentioned flame retardants, and it's my understanding that this whole flame retardant thing in our sofas and in other furniture and cushions was because of California and the fact that they passed very stringent rules and regulations about what needed to be in this furniture to reduce the risk of fires. But they've made a U-turn. Doesn't that mean that now we're safe?
Well, the whole flame retardant phenomenon is actually, unfortunately, a global problem. But you're quite right. California, for many years, had the most stringent standards for flame retardant, standards that were written by the flame retardant industry. So not surprisingly, these standards called for dousing every sofa, every mattress, every carpet in California with tons of these nasty chemicals. And just in the last year, California has changed its standards, and I have no doubt we're going to see other jurisdictions following suit. Part of that change, I'm sure, was due to some recent scientific evidence that came out in the last couple of years, showing that the levels of flame retardants in the bodies of Californians were sky high compared to the levels of flame retardants in people even in neighboring states. So, flame retardant's a great example of the kind of chemical we're talking about here, these innocuous chemicals that are in the consumer products we use every day that also happen to accumulate in our bodies and cause terrible health problems.
They're not so innocuous, you're saying.
Not so innocuous. The things they're in are innocuous. The chemicals themselves are invisible, but their effects are certainly not innocuous.
And long-lasting.
Yeah, that's one of the real problems with many of the chemicals that Rick and I talk about, is they're highly persistent in the environment, so they don't break down well. And, we've talked about chemicals like the chemicals that are used to make Teflon and stain-resistant coatings. Those chemicals persist for, hundreds or thousands of years in the environment, and we find now that they're in the bodies of polar bears and seals in the Arctic and basically 95% of the bodies of Americans as well. So once you have that combination of a chemical that causes physical harm and persists in the environment for many, many, many years, then that leads to a really troubling future.
Well, I am concerned about seals and polar bears, but I am more concerned about us. And I have two questions for you. You just mentioned, Bruce, that these compounds can cause physical harm, and I'd like you to be a little more explicit about that, if you can be. And then please explain to me how a compound that's in a sofa or a chair gets into my body.
Sure. And actually, I'll start with the second question first. So these chemicals, and in fact, it's interesting, when Rick and I were writing the first book, we were really focusing on how chemicals get in our bodies. And, and we discovered that we breathe them in as they're off-gassing. So your question specifically about flame retardants, they're off-gassing from the foam in our mattresses or in our sofas or the fabric, so we're breathing them in. Many of the chemicals that we refer to, things like phthalates, which are in a lot of personal care products, we absorb those chemicals through our skin. Our skin is our largest organ and just sucks these chemicals into our bodies. And then, of course, we're ingesting a lot of these chemicals just in the food that we're eating or the water that we're drinking. So those are the three main ways that the chemicals get into us. And it turns out that those are also pathways to eliminate those chemicals. So once they're in us, we've focused primarily on chemicals that are called endocrine disrupting chemicals. So they basically disturb our hormone systems as we're developing. And in particular, these are problematic for, the developing fetus or developing children. And what these chemicals do, we take the chemical BPA in plastic. It mimics the chemical estrogen or the hormone estrogen. So our body thinks that it's getting natural estrogen, which of course triggers different developmental triggers in our body, and also it contributes to breast cancer. We know higher levels of estrogen are one of the risks for breast cancer later in life. So basically we're seeing things like thyroid problems, developmental problems, various specific cancers, attention deficit disorder. These are many of the specific health problems that these chemicals are linked to.
I'd like to go back to those flame retardant chemicals for just a second and clarify that just because we don't live in California doesn't mean we're now home free. You mentioned that they have very high levels of these chemicals, the PBDEs, is that correct? And that maybe if we live in, let's say, New York State or maybe in Virginia or maybe Florida, so nothing to worry about, right? Wrong?
Yeah, so unfortunately, though Californians had higher levels than the rest of us until recently, every citizen of an industrialized country on the planet is going to have measurable levels of flame retardants in their bodies. This is one of the phenomena we write about in the book, that we're all united in our pollution at this moment in history. So we all buy the same brands of toothpaste around the world. We buy the same brands of furniture, and we buy the same brands of kitchen utensils. And so, somebody who's in England, somebody who's in Canada, somebody who's in Florida, somebody who's in Japan are exposed to very similar levels of these toxic chemicals, including flame retardants. Now the good news is that as big companies move to get these toxic chemicals out of their products, as is happening, we see levels of these chemicals coming down, sometimes very rapidly.
So that's really the good news of your book, because you talk about Toxin, ToxOut. So let's explain what the ToxOut part of the title means.
Great, yeah, and that is good news, and it's really important, I think, for people to understand that there is good news on this subject. Sometimes, people freak out a bit when we talk about all these chemicals. So there's sort of three basic things when it comes to ToxOut. The first one is we need to avoid products that we know have these chemicals. And that's getting much easier to do as well. Companies, for example, producing things like shampoos and soaps are now regularly putting on the bottle, phthalate-free, BPA-free, triclosan-free. So for the average consumer, we can actually start making those kinds of choices. Unfortunately, the labeling is poorly regulated and the products are poorly regulated. So this is typically companies that are voluntarily deciding that they don't want to be contributing to health problems of the people that are using their products. So avoidance is number one. The second one is in Toxin, ToxOut. We actually did a bunch of experiments to try to see how can we get these chemicals out of our bodies. So we can't avoid everything. We know we're breathing them in our offices, in our homes. So are there things we can do to get them out? So we looked at a bunch of different kinds of cleanses and things like chelation therapy, which is very effective for heavy metals, particularly mercury. We looked at sauna therapy, which amazingly, the experiments I did in the sauna collecting my sweat, I could actually see the BPA plastic coming out of my sweat and the phthalates coming out of my sweat. And then we just looked at what are the things that we can do in our daily routines, and basically how do you adopt a ToxOut lifestyle, which it turns out are all the things that any doctor is going to tell you to be healthy in the first place. So drinking more water, because that helps flush the toxins out of your system. Exercising more, which just gets your blood pumping and breathing, and those are the mechanisms that circulate the toxins and remove them from our bodies. And then eating less meat and eating more vegetables, particularly organic vegetables. So those are just basic things that if we're doing those on a daily basis, we know that we will be ingesting fewer toxins and helping eliminate them as we go forward.
Ingesting fewer toxins sounds like a great idea to me. You're listening to the authors of Toxin, ToxOut. Bruce Lowry is a leading environmental thinker, writer, and speaker. He's president of the Ivy Foundation and director of several other organizations in both Canada and the United States. Rick Smith is a prominent Canadian author and environmentalist. He's executive director of the Broadbent Institute and was the executive director of Environmental Defence Canada for almost 10 years.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll learn about phthalates and whether we should worry about plastics in our food packaging and water bottles.
Is organic food worth the extra cost?
We'll find out about new car smell and whether it's dangerous as well as enticing.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like this podcast of The People's Pharmacy and want to continue the conversation, you can join us online at facebook.com/People's Pharmacy to share your thoughts or comments. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
And by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you would like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 974. That number again, 800-732-2334. Or find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today on the People's Pharmacy, we're talking about how to get toxic chemicals out of our bodies and our lives. We are exposed to so many chemicals in so many places. Many times we don't even realize what we've been exposed to.
We're talking with Bruce Lowry, a leading environmental thinker, writer, and speaker. He's president of the Ivy Foundation and director of several organizations in Canada and the United States. Also, Rick Smith, a prominent Canadian author and environmentalist, executive director of the Broadbent Institute. He was the executive director of Environmental Defense Canada for almost 10 years. The two of them co-authored Slow Death by Rubber Duck. Their new book is Toxin, ToxOut.
Let's talk a bit about phthalates, because this is, first of all, a tongue twister, and it's spelled in a kind of odd way. Could you spell it for us, please?
Yeah, it's a ridiculous spelling. I mean, it's got a silent PH at the front end, so it's PHTHALATES. Increasingly, this is a word you'll see on the labels of products in the bathroom, though we're at this very weird moment in history where companies are not legally obligated to disclose the presence of phthalates in their products. What companies who are trying to get these things out of their products will do is they'll voluntarily label the absence of phthalates from their products. So increasingly now you'll see shampoos and conditioners with a big honkin' sticker on the bottle saying no phthalates. So that's something to look for in the grocery store.
What fascinates me is that you can go into natural food stores that in theory are, heavily organic in nature, and there are these big water jugs where you can fill up with, presumably this really fresh, pure water, but you're putting them into this big plastic container, or you might be buying fish or some other product that has been shrink wrapped in a plastic kind of sealant that more likely than not has phthalates. So are we being exposed to phthalates not just in our shampoos and conditioners and cosmetics, but also from the water we drink from those plastic bottles?
Yeah, plastic wrapping of food is one of the banes of my existence, especially organic food. And ironically, it seems that organic food is more packaged than non-organic food for some reason. So it's a problem in terms of the plastics that are used. Certainly the plastic in those water bottles is, typically, at least these days, going to be free of BPA. In the old days, they would have had BPA chemicals in those big plastic bottles. So, there is the risk that there will be some exposure in those packaged foods. And, my preference is always to try to buy, if you're buying, fish or something at a market like that, it won't be sitting there pre-wrapped in plastic for, a day or two. You just buy it fresh. And really, people shouldn't be drinking bottled water. There's no great need to drink bottled water. You should drink tap water. And if you're concerned about your particular tap water, there are all kinds of great countertop or under the sink filters to filter your water. So again, avoidance is the number one strategy in those situations.
Has anyone ever bothered to analyze the water in plastic bottles, whether it's, a small water bottle that you might carry with you to a sporting event, or whether it's the big bottles that you get from the distributor or at the health food store? Has anyone actually measured the water?
Yeah, absolutely. There's some very good scientific studies out there. And long story short, plastic bottles are not meant to carry the water for very long. So the age of the bottle, so if you have a disposable water bottle, for instance, in your car, and it's kind of sitting there for a few days, perhaps in the sun, in the heat. There's no question that the time and heat both start to break down plastics, and some of those constituent chemicals in the plastic start to ooze into the bottle. There's actually been one interesting recent study that tracked rising levels of chemicals in plastic water bottles over the course of a few days. And the more time went by, the more the chemical levels rose.
Well, you are describing one of Joe's nightmares.
Well, and it's not just water.
I'm sorry about that. We get accused of that sometimes at dinner parties.
Yes, I can imagine. You're not much fun.
But then we hasten to add, as Bruce just mentioned, that we're actually quite optimistic fellows, and the whole reason that we structured these experiments in the book is to demonstrate that all is not lost. That through doing a few things differently every day, by buying perhaps different brands, that you can actually very dramatically and very quickly lower levels of these toxic chemicals in your body.
Well, it's, as I was about to say, it's not just water. I mean, water is relatively inert. And so, of course, it scares me when I hear that water bottles, can leach plastic or phthalates in particular into the water itself. But it's all of those other containers. Like, you can now get vinegar in plastic. You can get spirits, alcohol, high concentration alcohol, vodka, for example, in plastic bottles. You can get fruit juice. In fact, it's almost impossible to not get fruit juice in plastic bottles, and presumably it's fairly acidic. And of course, soft drinks are fairly acidic as well, and they're often in plastic. So I'm just curious about the contents of the plastic bottle. Does that have any influence on what gets into the liquid?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are many different kinds of plastic that are used, and some plastics are better than others. Some are more stable plastics, and of course, if you look even at things, we didn't even get into yogurt containers and cheese, and plastic is an incredibly ubiquitous substance. So it's hard to imagine plastic going away, but I think we need to hold companies to account for the kind of plastics they're using to make sure that they're not the plastics that are more likely to leach chemicals into the food while it's sitting there.
Well, let's shift the focus just a little bit. We started off imagining ourselves in an organic food market and looking at the food that had been wrapped in plastic. And now let's look at the food itself. You discuss organic food, and this, for some reason, has been fairly controversial. Can you tell us about the science behind whether it makes any difference whether we eat organic food?
Yeah, unfortunately, the controversy is one of the things that drives Rick and I crazy. The studies that I think you're probably referring to are studies that suggest that there is no benefit to eating organic food because it has the same nutrient levels as non-organic food. But of course, if you're growing broccoli, it's going to have a certain amount of potassium in it, and it's not going to vary a whole lot whether you use chemicals on the broccoli or not in terms of the potassium levels. People don't buy organic food because they think they're getting necessarily more potassium. They buy organic food because they don't want to have chemical pesticides that cause cancer on their food. So, and there is a very direct link. The cause and effect between pesticide use and cancer is absolutely ironclad. And that's why you buy organic food. You don't want to be exposing your kids to chemicals that cause cancer. So that debate is completely spurious in my mind. It's the evidence is very clear. And the studies that we did in Toxin, ToxOut with kids eating organic food, we showed very clearly that the moment that they start, we have kids that were eating non-organic diets, the moment they switched to the organic diet, the pesticide levels in their bodies dropped dramatically. And when they switched back to the regular non-organic diet, the pesticide levels went up again dramatically. So we know chemical pesticides cause cancer. We know eating organic food lowers your levels of chemical pesticides. That's a pretty clear case for me to buy organic food.
But the whole issue of organic has become so complicated. I mean, there was a time when these were relatively small farms. There was not the factory farming there is today. and there wasn't the use of so-called natural synthetic compounds that may be quote-unquote certified, but maybe not as safe as we'd like to think they are. We've talked to family farmers who say, well, I may not be 100% certified organic, but I really treat my land very carefully, and I'm not using pesticides and herbicides. And my food is actually at least as good, if not better, than the big box organic food that's coming from some food factory. Can you help us understand that controversy?
Well, I'd say very simply that that you know what you're getting when you buy organic in the United States, in Canada, in Europe. In fact, increasingly there's a harmonized global standard. The word organic has a legal meaning. It's administered by a third party that tests pesticide levels, that actually visits farmers to make sure that they're conducting themselves in an organic fashion. So, the word organic has a certain quality control to it. Now that being said, there's a farmer's market about 4 blocks from my house, and I like nothing better than to go there with my wife and kids every weekend. And there's a lot of local farmers there who do not sell organic food, but who sell local produce that I know has probably lower levels of pesticides on it. So, I think local food from a farmer that is kind of a gateway drug for organic food. And what we're seeing is in North America, especially, is a very healthy movement of people looking to better understand where their food comes from, what kinds of pesticides are put on it or not put on it, and I think generally we're moving in a more organic direction.
So sometimes we're exposed to things almost against our will. And I'm thinking cars. And I'm thinking that new car smell that so many of us grew up with, thinking, wow, Dad just got a new car. Smell that. It's so cool. Maybe not so cool.
Well, I mean, who doesn't love the new car smell, really? I mean, I will confess that, they say that odor of all of our senses is the sense that triggers the most profound memories. And, so when I talk about this in the book, when I smell a new car smell, I remember my dad's 1972 Dodge Dart and, driving around the back roads of Maine. I mean, it kind of transports me to a very rosy place.
I remember my dad's 1955 Chevy. Oh, wow, what a cool smell.
Yeah. So, well, here's the thing. I mean, the new car smell is basically glorified glue sniffing. The new car smell is off-gassing glues, solvents, plastics in the manufacture of cars. And the new car smell is very similar to the new shower curtain smell and some of these other kind of potent aromas that we've grown up with. So we were interested in the book in trying to figure out whether these potent aromas, once breathed in, can actually result in measurably different levels of certain chemicals in the body. So we conducted one of our typically offbeat experiments, and I sat in a new car with an expert on this subject in Ann Arbor, Michigan, for a day. And we actually put the car in a climate-controlled storage locker to try to mimic a warm day. And we just sat there. I mean, all we did for this experiment is we just sat there for a day breathing in the new car smell in this Chevy Tahoe, actually.
You sat in the car for a whole day?
Well, and you had to mimic a warm day because actually it was like November, December, not real warm in Ann Arbor.
Yeah, it's actually, I think it's one of the more entertaining stories in the book. So by the time we got around to doing this experiment, it was November, as you mentioned. It's pretty nippy in Ann Arbor. But heat is one of the things that brings out the new car smell. So we wanted to mimic a hot day in Michigan. So we stuck this thing in a climate-controlled storage locker, and we sat there for a day just breathing. And, as you would do on a long road trip, or as people would do as they commute to work every day in the freeway. And what happened was we tested our levels of volatile organic chemicals, so things like benzene, formaldehyde, toluene, some of these nasty chemicals and the glues and the solvents that go into making a car. We tested our levels of these chemicals in our urine before and after sitting in the car. And what we saw was just an amazing, worrisome increase in these levels of chemicals in our bodies just as a result of breathing in. Now, the good news is that once you remove yourself from those aromas, the levels quickly come back down. So the punchline of this experiment is that these potent aromas that we live with every day can actually have a dramatic effect on chemical levels in our bodies. And so to the extent that you can shop for brands that don't off-gas in this way, you'll reduce toxic levels in your body.
How would you know if your vehicle is off-gassing a lot of these nasty chemicals or is not? Because once we turn on the air conditioning, those odors seem to fade away, or we become less sensitive to them.
Well, there are some great brands, increasing numbers of retailers and brands on the market now that are advertised specifically as low VOC products. So paints, for instance, have got a lot better over the years. And the paints today versus 10 years ago versus 20 years ago are much cleaner, much less toxic than they used to be. And low VOC paints that are advertised as such are particularly good. Carpet underlay, sofas are increasingly made with low VOC foam. Big retailers like IKEA, for instance, are trying to lower VOC levels in their products. Cars are a little bit more complicated, though our friends at healthystuff.org actually come out with a report card on new cars every year, actually ranking cars for how much they off-gas. So the car industry, Detroit is actually responding and trying to lower off-gassing levels in the cabins of their vehicles. There's lots of great progress in this area, and people should look for that low VOC label on products they're using in the home.
That certainly sounds like good advice.
Absolutely. And looking for the low or no VOC on a product is worth the time.
You're listening to the authors of Toxin, ToxOut. Bruce Lowry is a leading environmental thinker, writer, and speaker. He's president of the Ivy Foundation and director of several other organizations in both Canada and the United States. Rick Smith is a prominent Canadian author and environmentalist. He's executive director of the Broadbent Institute, and he was the executive director of Environmental Defence Canada for almost 10 years.
We need to take a short break. Coming up, we'll talk about water contamination.
Marines and their families at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina were exposed to toxic chemicals in their drinking water for years. What can we learn from their experience?
How can we detox? Is a sauna helpful? We'll also review the top 10 tips to avoid and get rid of toxins in our bodies.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening to this podcast of The People's Pharmacy. If you like it, why not rate or review it in the iTunes store? We'd appreciate it.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
And by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you would like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 974. That number again, 800-732-2334, or find it online. It's at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today we're talking about our exposure to toxic chemicals. Where are they, and how can we avoid them?
Our guests are Bruce Lowry, a leading environmental thinker, writer, and speaker, president of the Ivy Foundation. Rick Smith is a prominent Canadian author and environmentalist, executive director of the Broadbent Institute. Their new book is Toxin, ToxOut.
So we've been talking a little bit about exposure to chemicals that we wouldn't normally be aware of, like in the car or perhaps in a house that's been recently painted. But I'd like to go back to water for just a moment. We've talked earlier about plastic and water in bottles, and you suggested that, well, we could be safe just drinking water out of the tap. Maybe that's a better choice than water in a plastic bottle. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about Camp Lejeune in North Carolina and why that experiment was so deadly.
Yeah, that really is a tragic story where Camp Lejeune is a military base, as I'm sure you know, in the U.S. And what happened is they had different solvents that were being used, oils and cleaning solvents were being disposed of on site at the camp, and they ended up getting into the drinking water source for the people living there. And people started noticing, a lot of sickness, and then in particular there was an unusually high incidence of male breast cancer. And so a number of people started to connect the dots and became really concerned. There were people that noticed that, they could smell the volatile organic chemicals in the drinking water. And so the people of Camp Lejeune, the former military people and others who were just living on the base or, were born on the base that became very sick, finally got the, first of all, it took a lot of effort to get any kind of acknowledgement that this was a problem, and then finally ended up getting a specific legislation passed to compensate the victims of Camp Lejeune. But that is a tragic case of groundwater contamination. We had a tragic case in Canada where dozens of people died and thousands of people were very sick, and that's because we had, at the time, a lax, in fact, one of our earlier governments decided to deregulate the testing of municipal water, and this led to this tragic incidence of many people dying and many, many more getting sick. So when we talk about municipal drinking water, our basic assumption is that you have in place governments that are responsible, that are following recognized protocols to make sure that the water is safe and that the people living in those communities are aware of the safety of their water. Typically, municipal water is tested more rigorously than bottled water, so that's why we recommend drinking municipal water. Bottled water has even more lax standards. They test for fewer things and they test less frequently. And then, of course, it's being transported in plastic on top of that. So that's really why why we talk about tap water, and those isolated incidences are hugely tragic. But typically most Americans drinking municipal tap water will have clean water.
So we've talked a lot about avoiding toxic chemicals, whether it's in the new car, whether it's in the water supply, whether it's in our packaged foods. But now it's time to turn to the issue of getting the chemicals out of our bodies.
Well, I hope that you'll tell us a little bit about Peter Sullivan, a very interesting character in your book, and his adventures in detox. Why did he feel he needed to detox?
Yeah, Peter is a really interesting guy and was incredibly generous with his time with me, explaining basically his 10-year journey through detoxing. And for Peter, it was a combination of his own feeling his own personal health was declining, as well as seeing some issues with his kids in terms of their development and, some potential signs of slower learning or behavioral problems. And so Peter just had a hunch that it was a combination of things that they were exposed to, whether it was mercury fillings he was very worried about, the pesticides on his food, what they were breathing in the air living in California. And so he really took it upon himself to figure out how one would go about living a clean life and detoxing their bodies. And Peter was fortunate being an early high-tech guy. He had the financial ability and the time to investigate these things more than the average person. But I thought, what a great way just to learn about it and understand it is to spend some time with someone who had really investigated virtually every possible detox treatment and therapy under the sun, and see what we could learn from Peter. And the good news is Peter's healthy and happy today. His kids are healthy and happy. They're all feeling much, much better off than they were about 10 years ago when he started this journey. And he attributes it to the combination of things that we talk about, which is avoiding a lot of the chemical inputs, eating organic food. He's very careful about what he puts in his body, exercises, and he's experimented a lot with different cleanses and chelation and sauna therapy and those kinds of things, all of the stuff that we investigated through the book.
One of the more unusual things that you describe in the chapter in which you're discussing Peter's adventures is he built a house with a Faraday cage. Why? And what is it? And what did it feel like to spend the night in this bedroom that was inside a Faraday cage?
Yeah, well, I was, I had very different images.
This was Bruce's mission. We try to use, Bruce will tell you about this in a second, but basically what we tried to do with Peter was, as Bruce mentioned, is spend some time with a guy who has tried it all. And has concluded that some things work and some things don't, and so what we tried to do is kind of start with this kind of investigation of the weird and wacky world of detox, and then try to boil it down into something your average person could actually do, and try to figure out which of these many therapies actually work and which don't.
That's exactly right. The trick for us was, there's thousands of things on the market, and the detox world is as sketchy as the non-detox world in terms of claims that companies are making on their products. So we just wanted to try to provide some balance and reasonableness to what is the detox world. But getting back to the Faraday cage, so it's not this black hanging metal thing in the basement, which I was imagining. It was actually a fairly pleasant bedroom on the second floor of Peter's house in Northern California, where he had, well, first of all, the entire house, he went through an exercise of cleaning the electricity. There's a term that's called dirty electricity, which means that you can read the electromagnetic fields coming out of your electrical currents or light bulbs or wiring, things like that. So he did a cleaning exercise in the entire house, and then the Faraday cage itself is painted on the interior with a graphite paint and has metal screening on the windows, and that keeps any electromagnetic fields from coming into the room. And then there are various devices in the room that are constantly measuring the electromagnetic fields that might be, you might be exposed to. And then his bed has a grounded metal sheet on it. And so it's all designed to eliminate virtually down to zero the exposure to electromagnetic fields.
I'd like to talk a little bit about sweat when it comes to detoxing, because you actually suggest in the book that sweating is good for us, which makes me think about saunas and those folks in Scandinavia who just love their saunas. Maybe they actually knew something we don't know.
Oh, for sure. And in fact, they knew it a long time ago. In the history of the sauna in Scandinavia, in fact, all of Europe used to use saunas, really was a place where it was hygienic. It's where babies were born, 200 years ago. It was the only place. I mean, it predates the understanding of how steam and high heat kill germs, but intuitively, I think the Scandinavians knew that. So there's been recognized health benefits going way back. it turns out now that it is increasingly being used as a specific detox therapy. And the reason for that is we absorb a lot of chemicals through our skin. It turns out that we can release chemicals through our skin as well by sweating vigorously. And this is where drinking a lot of water comes in, because you want to have a lot of water in your body. You can't be dehydrated when you go into a sauna. And you're literally just sweating out these chemicals in our sweat. And what's interesting is certain chemicals come out of our sweat at a greater rate, or differentially at a higher percentage than they might out of our urine, which is another major detox pathway. So it means that if you're sweating in combination with other things, that you're enhancing your body's own natural mechanisms to remove some of these chemicals. So for me personally, I think saunas are fabulous. You feel great, your skin. I have people, when I was especially doing the experiments, I was having intensive saunas, and I'd have people that I barely knew stopping me saying, "Wow, your skin looks great." And I thought, well, that's a bit weird. But it's part of skin health. The saunas, in fact, I was joking with my daughter the other day and calling it pore exercise as opposed to core exercise.
I'd like to ask about chelation. It kind of has a bad rap and rep in the United States, but you actually looked into the idea of chelation therapy. It's recognized as a way to get rid of heavy metal exposure. Your thoughts about chelation as a detox technique?
Yeah, chelation definitely works for heavy metals, in particular mercury, but chelation therapy isn't something that you take lightly. You want to make sure that you are diagnosed with specific high levels of mercury. And in the U.S., the level of 8 micrograms per liter is what the EPA defines as the threshold, even though we know anything above 0 is problematic. But this is really a treatment that is quite invasive. You should have medical supervision when you're undergoing, and I'm speaking of intravenous chelation, not oral chelation. And because it does require an IV in your body, there's a fluid running through your body that is basically collecting the chemicals, but it removes them very dramatically. I just did it for a day and saw a dramatic increase in the amount of lead and tin and aluminum and things like that, mercury, that were being eliminated from my body. So it's basically a treatment that works, but it's a very specialized treatment for people who are being treated medically.
The chemical industry would probably respond to your book and to your research as kind of nonsensical, unnecessary, don't worry, be happy, because the levels of all of these chemicals in our bodies are so low, there's nothing to worry about. How do you respond?
Well, the chemical industry has a serious problem on its hands around the world, and that is that there's now a mountain of accumulating science pointing to the fact that chemicals long thought to be safe, bisphenol A, phthalates, triclosan, which is a very common antibacterial chemical, that in fact a lot of these chemicals are very readily absorbed by the human body and are driving increasing rates of serious human disease. So that's why you see breast cancer organizations now around the world advocating for improved chemical regulation, because the clear evidence that estrogen mimicking chemicals, all these toxic chemicals we're talking about, are driving increasing rates of breast cancer. So, Bruce and I have no doubt that over the next few years, because of this mountain of scientific evidence, that companies are going to be forced to change the formulation of their products for the better, and that governments are going to have to regulate in the public interest and get rid of a lot of these toxic chemicals.
Rick, you and Bruce end your book, Toxin, ToxOut, with a list of 10 top tips that we should all be following. In fact, you've boiled them down so you can tear out the page and stick it on your refrigerator. Would you please run over those for us, please?
Sure. Bruce and I both have kids, so we figure, all important lists have to be stuck to the refrigerator. So let's just start out with the chemicals that are easily avoided. Eating more organic food will dramatically lower pesticide levels in your body. Drinking more water and water from the tap will dramatically lower toxic chemical levels because your body will be better able to flush those chemicals. Switching up the products you use in the bathroom, getting away from products that contain phthalates and parabens, will reduce the number of chemicals that you absorb through your skin. Looking for low VOC, low off-gassing products for the home and for your office will reduce the number of toxic chemicals that you breathe in every day. And then there are a few things, after examining the whole wacky world of detox therapies, it turns out that some good old-fashioned exercise, scientists are now telling us, dramatically helps speed up getting rid of toxic chemicals in your body. So the more your heart is pumping, the more you get up off the couch and break a sweat, the lower your toxic chemical levels are going to be, because our bodies can flush themselves of these chemicals if you get more exercise. So those are a few of the things that we have experimented with. So we can say with some certainty, will ToxOut, will get those toxic chemicals out of your body and out of your kids' bodies.
Rick Smith, Bruce Laurie, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the co-authors of Toxin, ToxOut. Bruce Laurie is a leading environmental thinker, writer, and speaker. He's president of the Ivy Foundation and director of several organizations in Canada and the United States. Rick Smith is a prominent Canadian author and environmentalist. He's executive director of the Broadbent Institute and was the executive director of Environmental Defense Canada for almost 10 years.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineers the program. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 974. That number to call, 800-732-2334. Or you can look for it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our website, you can check out prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. You can share your own experience and thoughts on today's show.
Sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You need never miss another People's Pharmacy program again, and you could share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks very much for listening today, and please do join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.